The production of saltpeter, the essential oxidative ingredient for gunpowder, began not in a mine, but in the darkest, most pungent corners of human habitation, relying on a workforce that operated with the authority of the king and the resentment of the populace. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, before the establishment of vast artificial plantation beds became the primary standard, saltpeter men were granted the aggressive right to enter private property, to scrape the earth from cellar floors, stables, dovecotes, and sheep pens where nitrogenous waste had decomposed for years, protected from the rain. These workers sought the white, snow-like efflorescence that crept up the damp limestone walls of basements, a telltale sign that nature was slowly converting ammonia from urine and dung into the precious nitrates required for war. The air in these spaces was thick with the sharp sting of ammonia and the heaviness of mold, a sensory assault that the gatherers endured as they chipped away the salt-laden crusts and dug up the top few inches of soil, loading the foul-smelling earth into wheelbarrows, while the homeowners watched in helpless frustration as their floors were dismantled. This scavenged earth was rarely rich enough on its own to yield a high quantity of gunpowder-quality crystal, so the industry increasingly moved toward a more controlled, albeit slower method of generating the raw material through the construction of artificial nitraries. The transition from random scavenging to systematic cultivation required a massive influx of organic matter, demanding a supply chain of rot that connected the city to the manufactory. Carts laden with the sweepings of slaughterhouses, blood, rotting leaves, and the carefully collected urine from public houses and barracks were diverted to these specialized production sites. The logic was simple but chemically profound. By mimicking the conditions of a damp stable floor on a massive scale, the master salpetriers could farm the chemical components of an explosion. It was a messy, wet, and heavy business, relying on the constant transport of waste materials that most of society wished to forget, transforming the refuse of life into the instrument of death. The distinct, biting odor of a working nitrary was the first thing to greet a visitor, a smell that signified the slow chemical marriage of nitrogen and earth. To ensure a steady production that did not rely solely on the invasive scraping of peasant homes, the state began to encourage the erection of long sheds with watertight roofs to house the production. These structures were not merely storage, but active chemical reactors where the gathered soil and waste were not just dumped, but prepared for a long hibernation. The ground had to be prepared, the materials sorted, and the environment controlled to prevent the sun from drying out the volatile salts or the rain from washing them away before they could be harvested. This industrialization of natural decay required land, patience, and a labor force willing to work knee-deep in compost, setting the stage for a process that was more akin to gardening than manufacturing, though the fruit of this labor was a white salt rather than a crop of grain. The construction of a saltpeter bed, often referred to as a niter heap, was an exercise in precision, layering that resembled the building of a complex lasagna of filth and stone designed to maximize airflow and bacterial action. The workers would lay down a bed of clay or hard earth to prevent the precious liquor from seeping into the ground, and upon this foundation they stacked alternating layers of manure, rotting vegetable matter, and calcareous earth or old mortar salvaged from ruined buildings. The presence of lime in the mortar was crucial, providing the calcium base that would capture the nitric acid produced by the decomposing organic matter. These heaps were built up to 4 or 5 feet high and arranged in long parallel rows beneath the shelter of the sheds, creating a vast, silent landscape of decomposing mounds. The laborers worked with pitchforks and shovels, ensuring the mixture remained loose enough for air to penetrate, as the microscopic agents of fermentation required oxygen to do their work effectively. Time was the most stubborn ingredient in the recipe, as a niter bed required at least 2 to 3 years of maturation to become fully impregnated with saltpeter. During this long period of dormancy, the heaps could not simply be ignored. They required a ritualistic schedule of maintenance performed by apprentices under the watchful eye of the master. Every few weeks, the men would turn the heaps over, moving the material from the bottom to the top and the inside to the outside, ensuring even decomposition and preventing the pile from overheating or going anaerobic. They watered the mounds regularly, not with water from a well, but with the collected urine from livestock and humans, sprinkling the golden liquid over the earth to constantly feed the bacterial colonies with fresh ammonia. This dampening had to be precise, for if the heap became too wet, the reaction would stall, and if it became too dry, the nitrifying bacteria would die, forcing the workers to gauge the moisture by the feel of the clammy earth in their hands. The sheer physical scale of these operations in a major production center was staggering, with hundreds of tons of earth requiring manual turning, a task that built immense endurance in the workforce. The sheds were often dark and cool, protecting the volatile chemistry from the bleaching power of the sun, creating an environment where the only sound was the rhythmic scraping of shovels and the grunt of effort. As the months turned into years, the organic matter broke down completely, causing the heaps to shrink and the texture of the soil to change from a rough mixture of straw and mud into a fine, mellow mold. The mastery of the trade lay in knowing exactly how much urine to add during the summer heat versus the winter damp, balancing the atmospheric conditions to optimize the harvest. The bed was a living thing that had to be nurtured, and the success of the artillery corps depended entirely on the diligence of the men tending these piles of rotting earth, waiting for the signal that the transformation was complete. Determining exactly when the earth was ready for processing was an art form that relied less on visual inspection and more on the intimate senses of the master refiner. While a visual cue was present in the form of a fine, white, flour-like dusting that appeared on the surface of the heap, this efflorescence could be deceptive, sometimes indicating only a superficial concentration. The true test required the master to take a pinch of the dark, mellow soil and place it directly on his tongue, seeking a specific cooling, biting sensation that signaled the presence of nitrates, distinct from the salty tang of common sodium chloride. This physical connection between the craftsman and the raw material was the ultimate quality control, a skill passed down through generations that no manual could perfectly replicate. If the taste was sharp and cold enough, the order was given to dismantle the bed, and the cycle of excavation began. The extraction process was destructive and labor-intensive, as the laborers attacked the mature heaps with pickaxes and spades, breaking down the structure they had spent years tending. They did not remove the entire pile at once. Instead, they carefully shaved off the outer layers where the contact with the air had concentrated the salts, leaving the inner core to be remixed with fresh manure and lime to continue the process for another cycle. The harvested earth, now heavy with potential energy, was loaded into wooden barrows or wicker baskets lined with canvas to prevent spillage. The dust kicked up during this excavation was irritating to the lungs and eyes, coating the workers in a fine gray powder that tasted faintly of the chemicals they were mining. The floor of the shed became a hive of activity as the material was wheeled away to the leaching house, moving from the quiet, slow-paced world of biological decay to the urgent, heat-driven world of chemical extraction. Once the ripe earth was removed, the remaining material was immediately reconstituted with fresh additives, ensuring that the production line never truly stopped. The harvested soil, known as petrified earth, was not yet saltpeter in a usable form. It was merely a dirty matrix containing calcium nitrate mixed with insoluble grit and organic residue. The transport of this earth to the vats marked a critical transition point in the workflow, shifting from dry solids to liquid solutions. The laborers had to ensure that no foreign contaminants, such as stones or pieces of wood, were carried along, as these could damage the copper vessels used in later stages. With the earth piled high near the lixiviation vats, the focus shifted from the patience of the gardener to the precision of the chemist, preparing to wash the salts from the soil in a process that would separate the valuable spirit of the powder from the dead weight of the dirt. The transformation of the harvested earth into a liquid solution required a massive plumbing operation that relied on gravity, wood ash, and water. The workers transported the nitrogen-rich soil to the leaching house, where a row of large wooden tubs, often old wine casks with their tops sawn off, stood raised on trestles. The bottom of each tub was lined with a filter bed of straw and small twigs to prevent the spigot from clogging, acting as a crude sieve for the heavy sludge. However, the secret ingredient at this stage was not the earth itself, but wood ashes, specifically those from hardwoods like oak or beech, which were mixed directly with the niter earth, or layered in the tubs. This was the critical chemical intervention, though the workers understood it more as a rule of thumb than a molecular exchange. The potash in the ashes reacted with the calcium nitrate in the soil to produce potassium nitrate, the stable saltpeter required for gunpowder. Without the addition of these ashes, the result would be a hygroscopic slime that would ruin any powder it touched, making this step the bridge between agricultural waste and military-grade material. Once the tubs were packed with the mixture of earth and ash, the leaching began with the introduction of water, poured gently over the top to avoid disturbing the layers. The goal was to dissolve the salts slowly, allowing the water to trickle down through the mass, picking up the nitrates as it went, becoming a dense, yellowish liquor known as the mother water. The masters watched the flow from the spigots at the bottom of the tubs closely. The first run was the strongest and most valuable, while subsequent washings produced weaker solutions that were poured back over fresh earth in a continuous cycle of enrichment. This counter-current process ensured that no water was wasted and that the liquid sent to the boilers was as saturated as possible, saving precious fuel later on. The air in the leaching house was damp and smelled of wet wood and alkali, a distinct shift from the ammonia reek of the stables, marking the transition from biological decomposition to chemical extraction. The physical toll of this stage was immense, as the wet, spent earth, now stripped of its salts, became a heavy, sodden mud that had to be shoveled out of the tubs by hand. This sludge was not discarded, but was wheeled back to the niter sheds to be mixed with fresh manure, and started on the cycle of decomposition all over again. A closed-loop system that wasted nothing. The laborers worked in a rhythm of filling, soaking, draining, and emptying, their hands constantly wrinkled by the caustic lye solution. They used simple tools to test the strength of the liquor, such as floating a fresh egg or a weighted glass bead in the liquid. If the egg floated high enough to show a portion the size of a coin above the surface, the solution was deemed strong enough for the boiling house. This primitive hydrometer saved hours of unnecessary boiling, serving as the gatekeeper between the cold wash and the hot fires. The heart of the manufactory was the boiling house, a place of intense heat and deafening roaring where the weak liquor was forced to give up its water. The liquid was transferred into massive copper cauldrons, some large enough to hold hundreds of gallons, set into brick furnaces that consumed entire forests of fuel. As the fires were stoked to a fury, the liquid began to roll and boil, and the first impurities rose to the surface in the form of a thick, greasy scum. This scum, composed of organic proteins and dirt that had slipped through the straw filters, had to be constantly skimmed off by workers using long-handled ladles with perforated bowls. It was hot, dangerous work, requiring the skimmers to stand close to the bubbling vats, their faces shielded from the steam, flicking the waste into troughs while ensuring the precious liquid remained behind. The clarity of the final crystal depended entirely on the diligence of this skimming, purging the solution of the chaotic organic matter that had birthed it. As the water evaporated and the volume in the kettle decreased, a crucial separation occurred due to the differing solubilities of the salts involved. Common salt, sodium chloride, which was always present in the earth and unwanted in gunpowder, would crystallize and fall out of the solution while the liquid was still boiling hot, whereas the saltpeter remained dissolved. The master boiler had to lower a ladle to the bottom of the kettle to scoop out this white, gritty sediment, or rely on a suspended basket to catch it, effectively refining the solution in real time. This was a race against the fuel supply. The fire had to be kept hot enough to prevent the saltpeter from dropping, but not so fierce that the kettle boiled over. The workers fed the furnace continuously, their skin flushed and sweat dripping into the ash pits, managing a thermal balancing act that separated the good salt from the bad salt based purely on temperature and saturation. The climax of the boiling stage was determined by a specific set of visual and physical signs that only an experienced eye could interpret. The master would dip a spatula or a stick into the boiling liquor and let a few drops fall onto a cold piece of iron or a plate. If the drops set immediately into a solid white mass without spreading, the concentration was correct. Alternatively, they watched for the liquor to become oily and quiet, the violent bubbling subsiding as the density increased. At this precise moment, the fire was damped down, or the kettle was swung off the heat using a massive crane. To miss this window meant risking the formation of a solid block of salt inside the kettle, which would have to be chipped out with chisels, potentially damaging the expensive copper. The liquid, now a supersaturated magma of potential energy, was ready to be poured off, leaving the heat behind for the cooling phase. The hot, concentrated liquor was ladled or pumped into large, shallow cooling pans made of copper or wood, arranged in rows in a well-ventilated area of the manufactory. This stage was the most visually magical part of the process, as the chaotic liquid was allowed to rest and organize itself into geometric perfection. As the temperature dropped, the solubility of the saltpeter plummeted, forcing the salt out of the water in the form of long, slender, needle-like crystals. To encourage the formation of fine, pure crystals rather than large, impure lumps, the workers sometimes agitated the liquid gently with wooden stirrers, a technique that prevented pockets of mother liquor from getting trapped inside the solid structure. The cooling room was filled with the ticking and cracking sounds of the crystals forming and the metal pans contracting, a sharp contrast to the roar of the furnace room. Over the course of several hours, or even a couple of days, depending on the ambient temperature, the pans filled with a mass of white, interlocking needles that looked like jagged ice. This substance, known as gruff saltpeter, was not yet the refined snow-white powder used in muskets, but it was the first solid form of the product. The remaining liquid, still containing some dissolved salts and impurities, was drained off by tilting the pans or pulling a plug, to be returned to the boiling house for further evaporation. The workers then scraped the damp crystals from the sides and bottom of the pans, piling the raw saltpeter into wooden tubs. The crystals were often yellowish or brownish at this stage, stained by trace organic matter and earth, but they held the concentrated power of the thousands of tons of manure and soil from which they had been extracted. The final step for this rough product was a preliminary washing to remove the last of the sticky mother liquor clinging to the crystals. The gruff salt was placed in hoppers or boxes with false bottoms, and a small amount of water, or a saturated saltpeter solution, was poured over it to wash away the surface impurities without dissolving the crystals themselves. This washing left the saltpeter cleaner and more stable, ready to be packed into barrels and sent to the royal refineries. The men who handled the final product often had hands that were cracked and hardened by the constant exposure to the saline solutions, but there was a palpable sense of accomplishment in seeing the transformation complete. They had taken the foulest waste of the city, the scrapings of stables and cellars, and through water, fire, and patience, transmuted it into the crystalline fuel of empires. The gruff saltpeter, though crystallized, was still too impure for the delicate chemistry of high-grade gunpowder, containing traces of common salt and greasy magnesium salts that would attract moisture and ruin the powder. To achieve the pristine whiteness required by the crown, the salt underwent a second, more delicate boiling known as refining, where the chemistry of purification took a turn toward the visceral. The rough crystals were dissolved again in a minimal amount of pure river water within clean copper boilers, but this time the refiners added a clarifying agent to purge the microscopic dirt. The most common agents were bull's blood, white of eggs, or a solution of glue and alum. When thrown into the boiling vat, these protein-rich substances cooked instantly, coagulating into a thick, net-like scum that rose to the surface, trapping the remaining earthly impurities within its mesh. The sight of the boiling cauldrons during clarification was a strange juxtaposition of culinary and industrial imagery, as the thick, dark foam bubbled up, carrying with it the last ghosts of the stable floor. The workers stood ready with their skimmers, removing this scum with obsessive care, for any protein left behind would act as fuel in the final gunpowder, altering the burn rate unpredictably. As the liquid cleared, it became transparent and bright, signaling that the grosser contaminants had been evicted. The fire was then tempered, allowing the solution to simmer gently, which encouraged the last stubborn grains of common salt, which is less soluble in hot water than saltpeter, to precipitate to the bottom, where they could be ladled out or caught in a basket, leaving only the pure nitrate in the solution. This refined liquor was not allowed to cool into large crystals again. Instead, it was subjected to a technique called agitated crystallization. See here, as the liquid cooled in the pans, workers stirred it constantly and vigorously with wooden rakes or paddles. This constant motion prevented the formation of large, solid blocks of crystal, forcing the saltpeter to precipitate as a fine, snow-white flour or minute granules. This flour was far superior for the next stage of gunpowder production, as it contained no pockets of trapped mother liquor and was already in a fine state, ready to be mixed with charcoal and sulfur. The result was a pile of sparkling, distinct grains that looked remarkably like driven snow, a visual purity that belied its filthy origins. Even the whitest saltpeter flour held a secret enemy within its crystals: moisture, the bane of all artillery. Before the product could be barreled, it had to be dried to a level of arid perfection, a process that took place in the drying house, a room kept permanently hot and stifling. The wet flour was spread out on large copper sheets or wooden tables heated from below by gentle flues or braziers, designed to drive off the water without melting the salt itself. The temperature control here was critical. If the heat spiked too high, the saltpeter would fuse into a hard, glass-like cake that would have to be remilled, wasting time and labor. The air in this room was dry enough to crack the lips of the workers, who moved in a haze of fine white dust that settled on their eyelashes and skin. The laborers used wooden rakes to turn the salt continuously, ensuring that no damp clumps remained hidden at the bottom of the layer. This was a meditative, rhythmic task, shifting the white dunes back and forth as the steam rose and vanished into the rafters. They judged the dryness not just by time, but by the behavior of the salt. When it flowed freely like dry sand and did not stick to the wooden tools, it was nearing completion. A common test involved throwing a small pinch onto glowing coals, If it flashed instantly and violently without sputtering or hissing, it was dry. If it hissed, it meant water was still trapped inside, and the turning had to continue. This stage represented the final separation of the chemical from its aqueous history, severing the bond with the water that had been used to leach, boil, and wash it. The resulting product was fiercely hygroscopic, yearning to suck moisture back out of the air, so speed became essential once the drying was done. The warm, dry salt was quickly scooped into sacks or tubs, minimizing its exposure to the humid atmosphere of the general manufactory. The texture had changed from the slushy, gritty mud of the early stages to a fine, free-flowing powder that possessed a sharp, metallic ring when poured, a sound that signaled to the master refiner that the salt was essentially dead to water and alive to fire. Before the saltpeter could leave the refinery for the powder mills, it had to pass the scrutiny of the king's assayers, or the merchant buyers, who employed a rigorous set of tests to ensure no dead weight was being sold. The most famous of these was the refraction test, where a sample of the refined salt was melted into a disc and examined for opacity and texture, revealing any lingering grease or common salt. The men performing these tests held the power to reject tons of product, forcing the refiners to reboil entire batches at their own expense. This economic pressure ensured that the barrels lined up on the loading dock contained only the purest oxidizer, often rated at 98 or 99% purity, a remarkable chemical achievement for an era without modern laboratories. The packing process was robust, designed to protect the valuable dust from the rigors of the road and the dampness of the climate. The saltpeter was heavily packed into double-headed barrels made of seasoned oak, often lined with paper or linen to prevent sifting. The coopers hammered the iron hoops tight, sealing the white powder into darkness, stamping each barrel with the mark of the refinery, the date, and the weight. These barrels were heavy, dense with the concentrated potential of the earth, and as they were rolled onto the waiting carts, they represented a significant transfer of wealth. The saltpeter men, once the intrusive scrapers of cellar floors, were now the purveyors of a strategic resource more valuable per pound than the finest grain or timber. As the carts rumbled away from the manufactory, leaving behind the smell of wood smoke and boiling lye, the life cycle of saltpeter production concluded its first great act. The nitrogen that had begun as the waste of livestock and the urine of the city had been harvested, washed, tortured by fire, and purified into a pristine chemical agent. It was no longer filth. It was the breath of the cannon, waiting only to be married with sulfur and charcoal to change the map of the world. The gates of the refinery closed, and back in the sheds, the shovelers turned the fresh heaps of dung, beginning the long, slow harvest for the wars of the next decade. The empires of the past were not just built on gunpowder, but on the relentless patience of those who knew how to harvest power from the dust. Help us keep the memory of these forgotten trades alive by subscribing and sharing this video with those who appreciate the true grit of history. We want to hear your voice in the comments. What other lost industrial art should we excavate for our next journey?